Hi everybody, this is Professor Olney. Thanks for checking out this video. In this video I'm going to go through some of the basics of supply and demand. I'm going to assume that you've read the chapter, and so some of the background material I'm just going to skip over. And a lot of what I want to do in this one is just show you how the graphs work, so that you feel comfortable with the graphs. I don't think it's necessary to listen to this video before you complete the B Courses quiz, but if you have trouble with the B Courses quiz, it may be helpful to listen to the video. So I'll let you make that decision. But I am going to assume that everybody's listened to the video at some point during the week in which we're covering supply and demand. So there's some stuff in here that I'm just not going to take time to do during class. Okay, so with that, let me try to get started. So when we do the model of supply and demand, like any model, remember that models are always characterized by a question, by simplifications, and by assumptions. This model of supply and demand is probably the most important model that we do. It's the one where if you don't get this down, you're going to be lost for the whole semester. So it's very important that you get this model of supply and demand clear in your head and are able to use it in a lot of different situations. So that's why we're going to spend this extra time on it. So once again, models, as I said, are characterized by three things. They're characterized by a question, by simplifications, and by assumptions. For the model of supply and demand, the question that's being asked is what determines the price and the quantity of a product? Why does the pen that you're writing with cost $1.29 instead of $15? Why does the cup of coffee that I've got here on the desk that I have to be careful with not to spill on the equipment, why did it cost $2.30 instead of 22 cents? So what determines the price of products and what determines the quantity that we purchase? Speaking of the coffee, let me take a sip. It's decaf, by the way. It's also Peet's. So if you want good coffee, there you go. Anyway, back to what we're doing. All right, model of supply and demand. So what determines the price and quantity of a product? That's the question that's asked with this model. The key simplification of this model is there are two groups of people. There are buyers, and the buyers are going to constitute what we call the demand side of the model. And there are sellers, and the sellers are going to constitute the supply side of the model. Most of the times that we use this model of supply and demand, the supply side, the seller's side, you can think about that as what are the decisions that are being made within the firm about how much to produce in light of how much it costs to produce and how much what price the product can be sold for. The buyers, on the other hand, those are people, you and me, who are deciding how much of a product they want to purchase at each of various prices. The key assumptions that we make, and I don't know why those are now cruise ships, they were check marks, but it's all good. The key assumptions that we're making are first that the buyers are doing what it takes to maximize their satisfaction or utility. We don't define utility any further than that. So utility is what makes me happy. What makes me happy may be different than what makes you happy. I may get happiness out of doing for others. You may not get happiness out of doing for others. It's all good. What matters is that we are each trying to make decisions so as to maximize our satisfaction. And then the second assumption is that the sellers are doing what they do in order to maximize profit. So their goal is to maximize that difference between total revenue and total cost. Later on in the semester, we'll talk more about the profit maximizing decisions of firms. Today, all we're going to talk about is this bringing together of suppliers and buyers, of sellers and buyers. Okay. So on the let's see what my next slide says. Oh, it says what shifts demand. So let me back up and let me go over here to the whiteboard and draw some pictures. So when we do the model of supply and demand, we're going to start with a graph. We always start with a graph. And this is really fun. I have different colors and different pen sizes, and it's all very cool. On the vertical axis, we're going to put the price of the product. On the horizontal axis, we're going to put the quantity of the product. Now, what we went through in class is that it's always important to be specific about the product and also to think about what's the time frame. So oftentimes when people are talking about supply and demand, they don't actually mention the time frame, but you need a time frame because your answer to the question of how many pairs of jeans would you buy if jeans were $10 each, differs depending upon whether I'm talking about how many pairs would you buy per year or per month or per week or per day or per hour. And so I have to have a time frame on my quantity, and I also have to be very specific about the price, as we saw in class. So my favorite example has always been 6-ounce cups of chocolate flavored frozen yogurt. Not because I like frozen chocolate yogurt. I actually don't like the chocolate flavor, but it just rolls off the tongue. 6-ounce cups of chocolate flavored frozen yogurt. So we're going to think about how many 6-ounce cups of chocolate flavored frozen yogurt somebody wants to buy per week. So I've got my time frame on there. I'm pretty specific about what the product is. When we're looking at the buyer's behavior, which is once again the demand side of the model, what we know is that the demand curve slopes down. So D, demand. The demand curve, it starts and ends with D, which is the sneaky way of remembering that it slopes down. The reason it slopes down is this. Let me do some specific points just to make the point more clear. Let me draw some prices on here. $1, $2, $3, $4, $5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then let me draw some quantities along the horizontal axis. That's good. All right, so the demand curve, the idea is we have surveyed all the possible buyers of 6-ounce cups of chocolate flavored frozen yogurt and asked them how many 6-ounce cups of chocolate flavored frozen yogurt would you buy in a week if the price of a 6-ounce cup of chocolate flavored frozen yogurt was $1. We added up their answers. So this person would buy none, this person would buy 6, this person would buy 1. We added up their answers, 0 plus 6 plus 1 plus whatever else, and we found that at a price of $1, the quantity demanded in the market is, say, 1,000 cups. That gives me, I can capture that information, that at a price of $1, there's 1,000 cups of frozen yogurt demanded per week. I can capture that graphically with this one dot. So this dot is telling me that when the price equals $1, the quantity demanded equals 1,000. And then I go back to the same people and I say, yeah, well, suppose instead that the price of a 6-ounce cup of chocolate flavored frozen yogurt was $3. How many 6-ounce cups of chocolate flavored frozen yogurt would you buy in a week? Did I say $6? Let's say $3. Was $3, I have no idea what I said, was $3. How many 6-ounce cups of chocolate flavored frozen yogurt would you buy in a week if the price was $3? And people say, oh, not as much, that's kind of pricey. And so we add up their answers again, the 0 plus the 2 plus the nah, not at all. And we find out that at a price of $3, the quantity demanded is 600 cups. So I can capture that information that at a price of $3, the quantity demanded is 600 with a second dot, and that's what I've done here. So the idea of the demand curve is, suppose we ask this question over and over and over and over and over, and we asked it for lots and lots of prices. What we would find, for reasons that we demonstrate with the clicker exercise in class, what we would find is that we would get a downward sloping line. It might be a straight line, it might be curved. It doesn't really matter whether it's going straight down or whether it's coming down with a curve. That doesn't matter. What matters is that it's downward sloping. That as the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. As the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. We label that D for demand, and so the total curve is the demand curve. It's the entire set of combinations of prices and quantities demanded. Any one point on that demand curve is giving us information about the quantity that's demanded at a particular price. So quantity demanded is a number, like 1,000. Demand is a whole set of PQ combinations, so the demand curve. So that got us demand. And then, so let me just stick with demand. No, let's not. Let's move on. So that's the demand curve. And then if we wanted to look at the supply side of the market, we could, here again, look at the supply side of the market. Again, we're going to do it graphically. We're going to put price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. For my purposes, I don't really care at this point whether you use an uppercase or a lowercase q, and I dare you to tell me whether that's an uppercase or a lowercase p. So here, what we're doing is we're surveying the sellers of the product, and once again, it would be a similar exercise. We'll have various prices, $1, $2, $3, $4, $5, and we mark off quantities. And we go out and we survey all the people who are currently or could potentially be selling 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt. So once again, we're going to look at the frozen yogurt market. Give them a time frame. We're going to say per week. How many 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt would you be willing to sell in a week, willing and able to sell in a week, if the price that you could charge was $1? And then we go back, we ask the same people, how many 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt would you sell in a week? Would you be willing and able to sell in a week if the price of frozen yogurt was $3? Now, we're not asking them to project their demand. We're just saying, look, if this is the price you could get, don't worry about whether or not there's buyers. If this is the price you could get, how many cups of this stuff would you be willing to produce and hire workers to come in and produce and sell in a week? We find that the answers to that, which for reasons we'll explore later on in the course, carve out an upward sloping line. So the supply curve conveniently has the word up right there in the middle of it, and that's a nice way of remembering that the supply curve slopes up. So at a price, we say, for instance, at a price of $1, we add up all the individual answers. We find that the quantity supplied at a price of $1 is 200, and so we can draw this one dot that says when the price equals $1, the quantity supplied equals 200 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt per week. Ask them again, what would you do if the price was $3? We find out that at a price of $3, they would be willing and able to supply, say, 600 cups. So we have a second piece of information that at a price of $3, the quantity supplied is 600, and so on. Survey, ask a whole lot of different prices. What we'll find, for reasons that we will explore later on in the course, is that the market supply curve is going to be upward sloping. That as we increase the price, the quantity supplied increases. As the price falls, the quantity supplied decreases. Gather them together and we're going to get an upward sloping line. Now, it doesn't matter whether your line is a straight line or a curved line. Don't make it backward bending. That was an oops. Or a curved line. It does not matter whether it's straight or curved. What matters only is that it's upward sloping. So don't worry about, you don't have to get out a ruler. Just freehand it and you're fine. Okay, so that's the supply curve. And then we bring those two things together. So we bring together supply and demand, and that is where we start being able to talk about the determination of price. So once again, we've got the price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. I'm still looking at the market for 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt and how much of that would be demanded and supplied in a week. We had a downward sloping demand curve, and on the previous slide I had marked off prices. We had an upward sloping supply curve, and on the previous slide I had marked off actual prices. And what we find is there's one price and one quantity that is on both the supply curve and the demand curve. And if you go back and look at the numbers that I supposed, that turned out to be at a price of $3 and a quantity of 600, that at a price of $3, we had a quantity demanded of 600. I'll show you that in just a sec. And at a price of $3, we also had a quantity supplied of 600. Here, look, I'll go back. See, there's quantity supplied, $3, 600. There's quantity demanded, $3, 600. So at a price of $3, both the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied were 600. That means that that's one point that's on both the supply and demand curve. That's our equilibrium. Some people label that E for equilibrium. I tend not to label the equilibrium point because, as you'll see in a few minutes, we're going to move it around. So there's our equilibrium, and what we're saying here is if the price of 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt is $3, then the buyers will want to buy collectively 600 cups of frozen yogurt per week. The sellers will want to produce and sell 600 cups of frozen yogurt per week, and will be in equilibrium because there will not be a market surplus. There won't be more quantity supplied than there is quantity demanded. There won't be a market shortage. There won't be a greater quantity demanded than there is quantity supplied. We're at that beautiful price where quantity demanded and quantity supplied are exactly equal, and so we call that the equilibrium. All right, well and good. What's fun with the model of supply and demand and where it becomes really useful is using it for thinking about what happens when there are shifts or changes in either demand or supply. So let me see if I can go back to my PowerPoint. Awesome, there it is. Okay, and let me go back here and then go like this. Okay, so first let's think about what are the factors that shift demand. So first of all, if there's that's not supposed to be a Y, so let me squiggle that. If there's a change in price, we'll make that a colon. If there's a change in price, we're going to move along the demand curve. If there's a change in anything else, that's again not supposed to be a Y, we'll make it a colon. If there's a change in anything else that affects the quantity of demand, that affects that answer to how many cups of yogurt would you buy at this price, if there's a change in anything else, that's going to shift the entire demand curve. So what are the things that shift the demand curve? These are the 5 standard shifters. The 5 standard shifters of demand are the income of buyers, the wealth of buyers, all other relevant prices, the buyer preferences, and the buyer's expectations. Let me run through that with some graphs. Okay, so let me go to a new slide, and I think what I'm going to do, here we go, is I'm going to do this a little differently than I do it normally in class. Let me start out by drawing a couple of demand curves. So here's price again on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. My initial demand curve, I'm going to label it D1, so a subscript 1 to say this is my initial demand curve. And then let me just stop right there. Okay. Now, let's think about what happens if there is an increase in income, if the income of buyers is greater. If there's an increase in income, then at every possible price, so at some price, I'm going to call it generically price P1, at some price P1, the old quantity demanded is the amount that I'm going to read off that original demand curve. So I go from P1 over to the demand curve, dash it down, that's my old quantity demanded at price P1. And now, because incomes are higher, now there's going to be a greater quantity demanded. So the quantity demanded is going to shift to the right. So this is going to be the new quantity demanded at a price of P1 as a result of the increase in income. So people have more income, they want to buy more stuff. So at the same price, they'll buy more 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt. Or there's some people who previously had said 0 and now they say 1. Anyway, the overall market quantity demanded goes up. That would be true at every price. So at a price of P2, the old quantity demanded, we read off the original demand curve. As a result of the increase in income, there'd now be a new higher quantity demanded at that price P2, so on and so forth, gives us a second demand curve D2. So we say this is an increase, we refer to this as an increase in demand, and we call it an increase in demand because there's an increase in the quantity demanded at every possible price. So if there's an increase in income is one of our demand shifters, and it shifts the demand curve to the right. Similarly, if there's a decrease in income has the opposite effect. At some price, let me change my notation. At some price, I'll call it P sub A, the old quantity demanded at price P sub A, I read off the original demand curve D1. So I went from P sub A over and dropped it down. And now, if the incomes go down, people are not going to buy as much of whatever this product is. And so there's going to be a new quantity demanded that's smaller at that same price P sub A. So I draw that dot in. That gives me the combination of price P sub A and the new lower quantity demanded. That would be true at every price. Choose some other price P sub B. The quantity demanded again would fall. And so I would wind up with a new lower demand curve. I'll call it D sub B I'll call that A and B instead of 1 and 2. How's that? And we call that a decrease in demand because there is a decrease in the quantity demanded at every price. Okay, cool? Cool. Except there are some products for which a higher income does lead us to buy more of that product, like, for instance, 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt or cars. There are other products that we buy less of as our income goes up. So, what's an example? Oh, a good example is spaghetti sauce, it turns out, is an example of that. During the Great Recession, there were lots and lots of people who lost their jobs. There was a surge in the sales of spaghetti sauce because a lot of people who had been eating dinner out could not afford to eat dinner out anymore. And so you pick up some spaghetti and some spaghetti sauce at the grocery store, come home, voila, you've got dinner. And so when people's incomes went down, they bought more spaghetti sauce and fewer restaurant meals. So an increase in income increases demand if it's what's called a normal good, something like yogurt. A decrease in income decreases demand, again, if it's what's called a normal good. Let me put a little squiggle here so you can see that I've got two different things going on. But I'm going to change colors because I can and it's fun. But if it's an inferior good, if it's one of those things like spaghetti sauce where you buy more of it when your income goes down, then, let's see, an increase in income for an inferior good will decrease demand. So when income went up, people switched away from spaghetti sauce and back to restaurant meals. And a decrease in income for an inferior good will cause an increase in demand. So the picture on the left works for income going up if it's a normal good, but income going down if it's an inferior good. And the picture on the right works for income going down if it's a normal good and income going up if it's an inferior good. So you have to know, on average for the economy as a whole, do people flock to this good or away from this good when income goes up? Okay, so that was the first one, was income of buyers. The second factor that also affects the demand curve, things that can shift the demand curve, is wealth. And with wealth, you can also think about normal and inferior goods with wealth. Most goods are normal goods, and so an increase in wealth with a normal good would also shift the demand curve to the right, increase demand. And a decrease in wealth with a normal good decrease in wealth would shift the demand curve to the left. But if it was an inferior good, harder to think of examples, but if it was an inferior good with regard to wealth, a decrease in wealth with a inferior good, one that responds inversely to wealth, would increase demand, and an increase in wealth with an inferior good would decrease demand. The picture's there. It's all good. Okay. Let me skip the third one because I'm going to run out of room. Buyer preferences. If preferences shift in preferences. If preferences shift in favor of the good, so people like it more, that's going to lead to an increase in demand. If preferences shift away from the good, so it's like, oh, that causes cancer. Maybe not. Preferences shift away from the good. That's going to cause a decrease in the demand. So lower quantity demanded at every price. Okay, let me do a new slide to do something else. Okay. Let me go back to the third reason that was on that slide, which is all other relevant prices. This is taking a really long time. I'm sorry this video is so long. I thought that I would be able to knock this one out in half an hour. Clearly not. But nevertheless, let's keep going. So if there is two goods are substitutes, if two goods are substitutes, you can think of that as either or. We're going to buy one or the other. I could buy ice cream or I could buy frozen yogurt. I'm not going to buy both. Both of them are satisfying the same need. So I'm either going to get ice cream or I'm going to get frozen yogurt. They're both nice and cold and cool on a hot day. So the question is, what happens if there's an increase in the price of the substitute? So let me use the ice cream and frozen yogurt example to make this clear. So if there's an increase in the price of ice cream, then an increase in the price of ice cream is going to move us along that demand curve for ice cream. A higher price of ice cream is going to lead to a decrease in the quantity demanded of ice cream, and people are going to substitute the frozen yogurt. So at every possible price of frozen yogurt, there's going to be a greater quantity demanded of frozen yogurt. So the higher price of ice cream leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded of ice cream. And because people still want something cool to eat as a dessert, it's going to increase the quantity demanded of frozen yogurt. Where do I want to write this? At every possible price of frozen yogurt. How do we show that? Well, here we go. Price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, downward sloping demand curve. The first one, D1. This again is the market for frozen yogurt. What's happened is at every possible price, like a price of P1, the quantity demanded has increased. There's a higher quantity demanded at price P1. There's a higher quantity demanded at price P2. That's true at every possible price. And so we get an entirely new demand curve. I don't know why I have that cute little pencil there now. We have a new demand curve D2 as a result of the increase in the price of the substitute. So the increase in the price of the substitute leads to an increase in the demand for, let me call it the original good, or the good that we're talking about. The increase in the price of the substitute leads us to buy more of the original good. So higher price of ice cream, we're going to have an increase in the demand for frozen yogurt. You can flip that over. Here, let me put that in a little box down here. Let me change colors because I just think it's so fun to change colors. So the decrease in the price of the substitute would have the opposite effect. The decrease in the price of the substitute would lead to a decrease in the demand for the original good. So for instance, if there's a decrease in the price of ice cream, we're going to buy more ice cream, and so it's going to decrease the demand for frozen yogurt. Good? Good. Happy. Okay. What about complements? It's really making me nuts that that little pen is there, but it's okay. It's all good. Okay, complements. Complements are things that are used together. Cookies and milk. Cheerios and milk, I think. Cheerios and milk. Peanut butter and jelly, I think. Cars and gasoline. And in this case, frozen yogurt and sprinkles, because you got to get your sprinkles on top of your frozen yogurt. So what happens if there is an increase in the price of a complement? Well, once again, let me make it specific. If there's an increase in the price of the sprinkles, the increase in the price of the sprinkles, ooh, I have to have sprinkles with my frozen yogurt. I mean, what's the point in getting a 6-ounce cup of chocolate flavored frozen yogurt if I can't get Oreo crumbles on top? I mean, it doesn't work. And so if the price of the Oreo crumbles, the sprinkles that go on top of the frozen yogurt, goes up, I'm not going to want as many sprinkles, and therefore I'm not going to want as much yogurt. So it's going to decrease, it's going to move me along my quantity demanded for sprinkles. It's going to decrease the amount of crumbles of Oreos that I want on top of my frozen yogurt. And if I can't have the crumbles, I'm not going to buy the yogurt. And so it's going to lead to a decrease in the quantity demanded of frozen yogurt at every possible price of frozen yogurt. So once again, let me show that in a picture. Price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. Here's my initial demand curve. D1, excuse me, it costs more for the sprinkles, and so at a price of, say, $4, instead of the old quantity demanded at that price of $4, now I don't want to buy as much frozen yogurt. So let me write up here just to be sure. This is the market for frozen yogurt. How much frozen yogurt do I want to buy in a week? So sprinkles went up. I don't want as much frozen yogurt. It's just not going to, I can't have my chocolate yogurt without my sprinkles. So the sprinkles are more expensive. I'm not going to buy as much frozen yogurt. The quantity demanded goes down. There's a new lower quantity demanded at that price of $4. And that's going to happen at every possible price of frozen yogurt. And so what's going to happen is the entire demand curve is going to shift to the left. We have a new demand curve at every possible price. So the increase in the price of the complement leads to a decrease in the demand for the original product, original good. So here what we have is a decrease in demand for frozen yogurt. Frozen yogurt. Okay. All right, that's a lot. This video is getting pretty long. I had one more, which is buyer expectations. Let me do that one. And then I'll do the supply, and then I'll bring it all together. I guess this is going to be longer than I thought. But there you go. Okay. New slide. Okay, the last one I didn't do yet was buyer expectations. And buyer expectations, sloppy handwriting, sorry. Buyer expectations is kind of vague. Hope that's okay. Well, it has to be okay. So there you go. Buyer expectations is kind of vague. What it means, it can mean their expectations. So expectations generally is what do you think is going to happen in the future? So what do you think is going to be happening in, where are we? In November, December, January, February. Buyer expectations. We can think about expectations of income. So if you expect to start a job in 3 months and you know how much you're going to be paid in 3 months, it's very likely that you're going to increase your spending today for normal goods based on your expectation of higher income in the future. If you expect to lose your job, it's likely you're going to cut back on your spending today because you're going to need to start saving some in order to pay for food and shelter and so on once you lose your job. So buyer expectations of income are going to affect demand. So again, we have to think about normal versus inferior goods. And for a normal good, we're now going to get the same effects that we had with income. So for a normal good, an increase in income, I'm going to put an E here, watch. The E up there stands for expected. So that superscript E is the expectation. So what I expect my income to be in the future. An increase in income is going to lead to an increase in demand, and a decrease in expected income is going to lead to a decrease in demand. For an inferior good, it's just the opposite, because remember, inferior goods are things that you don't buy as much when your income goes up. So an increase in expected income means you decrease your demand for those inferior goods, and a decrease in expected income means you increase your demand for those inferior goods. Wealth would work exactly the same way, so let me just add in here, or wealth. So if there's a change, an expected change in the value of your assets, it would have the exact same effects as the change in income, just a much smaller effect. So the dollar for dollar effect of a change in income is, I forget the numbers are, much, much larger, I think 10 times larger than the dollar for dollar effects of a change in wealth. We could also talk about buyer expectations of prices. That gets a little messier. We don't usually do that in Econ 1. And what I'm going to say is Do this in 100A. Or maybe the psych and econ class, or maybe industrial organization, or maybe public finance, or maybe finance 136. So buyer expectations of prices are also going to impact what people do. It's just not an example I'm going to use at all in Econ 1, so let me just postpone that, let you cover that in another course. Okay, that was a lot. Whew, exhale. Okay, this is a good time to take a pause. There's more to come, but if you're trying to figure out when you can pause this thing and go off and do something else, this would be a good time. So take a pause. I'm going to keep going, but you can take a pause. Okay. Pausing, 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 and now I'm going back. Okay. Hello, you're back. Now, we talked about what shifts demand. Let's move on. Is that going to work? Nope, hold on a second. Move on and talk about what shifts supply. There it comes. Ooh, let me erase those. There we go. So what shifts the supply curve? Once again, let me fix this. That's not supposed to be a Y. If there's a change in the price, we're going to move along the existing supply curve. If there's a change in anything else that is relevant to the supply relationship, it's going to shift the supply curve. The usual shifters of the supply curve are these. So the input costs, how much it costs to produce things, technology, prices of related products. In this sense, we're going to be talking about the prices of related outputs and the number of sellers. Let me cover just the first and the fourth of these in the video and leave the second and the third to the textbook for now, just because I'm aware of how long this video has become. Okay, so where do I want to go here? There we go. Next. Input costs. Input costs. All right, so what we're thinking about here is, sorry about my handwriting. What we're thinking about here is how much does it cost to produce? So for back to frozen yogurt, what's the cost of electricity? What's the cost of the frozen yogurt mix? What's the cost of the cups? What's the cost of the labor? All of those things. So the costs of producing. So suppose there's an increase in input costs. So suppose it becomes more expensive to produce each 6-ounce cup of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt. Well, if it's more expensive to produce each 6-ounce cup of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt, then at any given price, $1, $2, $3, the seller will not want to sell as much of the product. We're going to spend a week and a half talking about why in another week or two. 2 weeks, I think. So let's sort of just trust me on this, if you would. So when there's an increase in input costs, what happens is there's a decrease in the quantity supplied at every price. The amount that the sellers would be willing and able to sell at each price goes down because it's costing them more to produce and it's just not as profitable for them to do the production. And so if I draw that, again, price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, and I've got my initial upward sloping supply curve, I'll call it supply S1. Let me choose some price, I'll call it P1, dash it over to the supply curve, dash it down. That's the old quantity supplied at a price of P1. And then input costs go up. And when input costs go up, the effect of that is to decrease the quantity that the market wants to supply at that price of P1. So I'm going to have a new quantity supplied at that price of P1 to the left. It's a decrease, so it goes to the left along the horizontal number line. The number line is the one on the left, on the horizontal line. Going to the left. A lower quantity supplied at that price P1. Choose some other price P2. And again, at that price P2, there's now going to be a lower quantity supplied at that price P2, and that's going to be true for every possible price. And so then if we bring together all of those combinations of prices and quantity supplied, we're going to get, make your dot bigger if it doesn't go through your line, we're going to get a new supply curve to the left of the old supply curve. What we say here is this is a decrease in supply. because what we've got is a decrease in the quantity supplied at every price. Squiggle. On the other hand, if there had been a decrease in input costs, if labor had gotten cheaper, for instance, then we would have an increase in the quantity supplied at every price of frozen yogurt. So at every possible price of the frozen yogurt, there would be a higher quantity that the market would be willing to supply. So here's price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. My initial supply curve S sub A, just to make it different. Choose some price P sub A, go over to the supply curve, go down. There's your old quantity supplied at a price of P sub A. And now, as a result of input costs getting cheaper, the businesses would want to produce and sell more frozen yogurt at a price of P sub A. And so there would be a new higher quantity supplied at that price P sub A. That same thing would happen over and over. At a price of P sub B, you'd get the same answer. Oh, now I want to produce more. So there'd be a higher quantity supplied at a price of P sub B and P sub C and so on. The entire supply curve shifts to the right. We'd have a new supply curve, I'll call it S sub B, to the right of the original supply curve. We call that an increase in supply, because there's an increase in the quantity supplied at every price of frozen yogurt. Okay, so that's input costs. Let's see, what else can I put on this graph? If instead of looking at an increase in input costs, if we're looking at an increase in the number of sellers, more sellers means there's a greater quantity that would be supplied at each and every price. So an increase in the number of sellers would lead to an increase in the quantity supplied at every price. So again, I'm on the right-hand graph. And a decrease in the number of sellers would lead to a decrease in the quantity supplied at every price. Prices of related products I think is fun and groovy, but I don't want to take time to do it because this video is already way too long. Technology works as does input costs. So there's not increases, there's not pluses and minuses. We'll call it improving technology. So if there's a improved technology, typically what an improved technology will do is it'll lower the input costs, and then we just go from there. It's hard for me to imagine the destruction of technology. I suppose we could, I don't know how you can destroy technology in the sense of like an earthquake destroys machines. I don't know how you destroy knowledge. Hopefully you can't destroy knowledge. That's a bigger topic. We won't talk about destruction of knowledge. Okay, all right. Now we're ready for the groovy stuff. Now we're ready to talk about changes of equilibrium. If there is, let me go back to my slideshow. And let me erase that. If there is a change in demand, so the whole demand curve shifts, or a change in supply, or both, which is going to happen when one of those ceteris paribus assumptions is violated, then we're going to get a whole new equilibrium. So remember, we had those 5 demand shifters and we have the 4 supply shifters. The 5 demand shifters: income, wealth, other prices, buyer preferences, and expectations. The supply shifters: input costs, technology, prices of related products, numbers of sellers. Okay, here we go. Oops, there we go. All right, let's do a picture. Suppose something happens to lead to an increase in demand. So remember, an increase in demand means a increase in quantity demanded at each and every price. So draw your axes, and let me choose a color here. Violet. Let's do violet. Price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. If you want, why not? Let's just stick with frozen yogurt. So let's stick with the market for frozen yogurt. It's fun. So this is the number of 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt that people want to buy in a week. There's some initial demand curve, D1. Again, it doesn't matter if it's a straight line or not. Don't worry about it. Just downward slope. An upward sloping supply curve, S1. There's an initial equilibrium. And at that initial equilibrium, the initial price is price P1, and the initial quantity is quantity Q1. Now suppose that there is an increase in income. That would give me an increase in demand. Suppose there's anything that gives me an increase in demand. So an increase in income would do it, an increase in wealth, a decrease in the price of ice cream, and so on. That increase in demand is shown as a shift to the right of the demand curve D2. And what will happen? Well, essentially, I don't know if I can do this. Essentially, what's happened is this old demand curve D1, ooh, goody, look, good. This old demand curve D1, it no longer exists. The demand curve D1, that's what was true in the past, but it's not true anymore. That set of combinations of prices and quantities, old news, not true anymore. What's true now is that the demand, the set of prices and quantities, are captured by that demand curve D2. And that price P1, well, that price P1 is associated with the quantity supplied because it's still on the supply curve, but a much higher quantity demanded. So at price P1, this is now the new quantity demanded at price P1, and we no longer have equilibrium because quantity supplied and quantity demanded are not equal. That's going to put upward pressure on the price because there's this market shortage. Quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. There's a market shortage equal to that horizontal distance between these two dots that are there. And so the price is going to start to rise. As the price starts to rise, we move along both the supply and the demand curve. As the price rises, the quantity supplied increases. We're moving along that supply curve. As the price rises, the quantity demanded decreases. We're moving along demand curve D2 until we reach the new equilibrium. The new equilibrium, let me dash it over. We'll call that price P2 and quantity Q2. So when there's an increase in demand, when the entire demand curve shifts to the right, we wind up with an increase in price and an increase in quantity in the equilibrium. Flip it over. If there's a decrease in demand, I'm not going to draw it because I've been here now for like almost an hour. If there's a decrease in demand, it would give us a decrease in price and a decrease in quantity, comparing the new and the old equilibriums. Okay, that's cool. Now, what about if we have an increase in supply? Now suppose instead, so this is instead, not also, but instead, again we're looking at the frozen yogurt market. So the amount of frozen yogurt that's sold per week. Price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, initial downward sloping demand curve, D1, sure. Initial upward sloping supply curve, S1. The initial equilibrium is where those things cross, so price P1, quantity Q1. Suppose that there's an increase in supply. It could be a decrease in input costs. Let's think about what happens if there's an increase in the number of sellers. So there's an increase in supply, there's an increase in the number of sellers, and when there's an increase in the number of sellers, what that means is that at each and every possible price, there's an increase in quantity supplied, so the entire supply curve shifts to the right. In effect, what's happened is this old supply curve, the let me fix that in a minute. The S1 supply curve, it ceases to exist. It doesn't exist anymore. That's just, it's about the past. It's not about the present. It doesn't exist anymore. What exists now for the supply relationship is that supply curve S2. Well, at that price P1, the new quantity supplied at a price of P1 is greater than the quantity that's demanded at that price of P1. And so P1 is no longer equilibrium price because now there is a market surplus at that price of P1. The existence of the market surplus is going to put downward pressure on the price. And as the price falls, the quantity demanded will rise, demand curve slope down. The quantity supplied will fall, until we wind up at the new equilibrium where supply 2 and demand 1 intersect. And that's at a price of P2 and a quantity of Q2. So what do we get? We get that when there's an increase in supply, which remember means that the supply curve is shifting to the right, that increase in supply is going to lead to a decrease in price and an increase in quantity, comparing the new and the old equilibriums. If you flip it over, that is to say, if you decrease supply, which is to say shift the supply curve to the left, decreasing the quantity supplied at each price, the result is going to be an increase in price and a decrease in quantity, comparing the new and the old equilibriums. Cool. We're starting to be able to tell stories. There's one more story, and it gets a little more complicated, and that's what happens if both of these things shift at the same time. Now, in section, you're going to go through a variety of scenarios, and I'm going to just show you a couple of them here to try to illustrate what the challenge is when you have both things shifting at once. So here, let's draw, there, that's better. Let's draw our initial graph. So we've got price and quantity. Draw your initial demand curve D1. Draw your initial supply curve S1. Mark off your initial equilibrium, price P1, and quantity Q1. If it's confusing to you to have those dashed lines there when I went from P1 to Q1, you can get rid of them, except now I've really made a mess. So let me see if I can fix it. There. And there. But I think it's good to have. Here, let me just make little dashes. Okay. There you go. So there's our initial equilibrium. So let's do this. Let's suppose that we have both an increase in demand and an increase in supply at the same time. What we saw on the previous screen is that an increase in demand leads to an increase in price and an increase in quantity. And an increase in supply, a shift to the right of the supply curve, leads to a decrease in price and an increase in quantity. Since we're going to do both the increase in demand and the increase in supply at the same time, what we're going to see is that the quantity definitely is going to increase, because both of those things, both the increase in demand and the increase in supply, are putting upward pressure on quantity. Excuse me. But the effect on price is ambiguous, because the increase in demand is increasing the price, but the increase in supply is decreasing the price. And so what matters is the relative size of the shifts in demand and supply, and that's the only way you can figure out whether the price goes up or goes down. If you have a big increase in demand and a small increase in supply, the net effect is going to be the increase in price and, again, an increase in quantity, because the increase in price, the effect on price from the demand, is going to swamp the effect on price from the supply. If you have a small increase in demand but a big increase in supply, then the supply part is going to have the dominant effect on price, and the net effect is going to be a decrease in price and, again, an increase in quantity, comparing the new and the old equilibrium. So let me draw at least one of these for you. So let me draw a big increase in demand, D2, and a small increase in supply. Remember, increases mean the quantities are increasing at every price. So the new equilibrium is going to be at the intersection of demand 2 and supply 2. And you can see, dashing it over, the price has increased and the quantity has increased. So this is what I've done. Big increase in demand, a small increase in supply, gave me an increase in both the price and the quantity. Let me show you the contrast. So here, again, I'm going to put price on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal, my initial downward sloping demand, initial upward sloping supply, initial equilibrium, price P1, quantity Q1, and I'm going to do an increase in demand, which by itself we know would increase price and increase quantity, and an increase in supply, which we know would decrease price and increase quantity. And the net effect on price, once again, depends upon the relative sizes of the shifts in supply and demand. So in this case, let me assume that I have a small increase in demand and a big increase in supply. So I'm going to shift my demand curve just a little bit. Demand D2. I'm going to shift my supply curve a lot. Supply S2. I'm going to find the new equilibrium, dash that over, label it price P2, dash it down, label it quantity Q2, and you can see what's happened is that there's been a decrease in price because price P2 is less than price P1, and again an increase in quantity because quantity Q2 is greater than quantity Q1 as a result of the shift. So when you have a double shift, when both demand and supply shift, there will be an ambiguous effect. So in this case, I had both of these things going up, and the effect on quantity was clear, but the effect on price, the net effect on price, was ambiguous. If they both go down, the same, I'm still going to get a clear effect on quantity, but an ambiguous effect on price. And then the last possibility here is, let me do one more graph for you. And then I think we're going to call it quits on this particular video because this has gone on way too long. All right, so then let me show you one more. And this is having the mix of increase in demand and a decrease in supply. So once again, let me draw the starting graph. So we're going to have a downward sloping demand curve D1, upward sloping supply curve S1, initial equilibrium price P1, quantity Q1. And this time, let's explore what happens if there's an increase in demand and a decrease in supply. So what we know is we know the increase in demand will cause an increase in price and an increase in quantity. And we know a decrease in supply will cause an increase in price and a decrease in quantity. If both of those things happen at the same time, it's pretty clear what the price effect is going to be. Both the increase in demand and the decrease in supply are putting upward pressure on the price. But the quantity effect is ambiguous. We don't know without more information whether quantity is going to go up or down, because the increase in demand is making quantity go up, but the decrease in supply is making quantity go down. So if there is a big increase in demand and a small decrease in supply, then, well, we know the price effect. It's always going to be an increase in price. The demand effect is going to dominate on the quantity, and so the net effect is going to be an increase in quantity. If there's a small increase in demand and a big decrease in supply, again, clearly the price will go up, and now the supply effect on quantity will dominate, so we'll have a decrease in quantity. Let me show you both of those here. So on the left, now I'm going to draw in a big increase in demand. There's a big increase in demand, D2, and a small decrease in supply. So the supply curve is shifting to the left, S2, there we go. Find my new equilibrium, dash it over, price P2, dash it down, quantity Q2. And you can see that what's happened is the price has increased because price P2 is greater than price P1, and the quantity has increased because quantity Q2 is greater than quantity Q1. On the other hand, suppose that we have the small increase in demand and the big decrease in supply. Let me draw that down here at the bottom. So we have demand D1, supply S1, initial equilibrium, price P1, quantity Q1, and now, ta-da, I'm going to have a small increase in demand, demand D2, a big decrease in supply, supply S2. The new equilibrium is where S2 and D2 intersect. Dash it over, I've got price P2. The price rose. Of course the price would rise because both of these things are causing price to rise. And the quantity fell. So we've got an increase in price and a decrease in quantity because we've got a small increase in demand and a big drop in supply. Alrighty, that was a lot. This was actually a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. I thought I could knock this out in a half an hour. Took me over an hour, but hopefully it's been really helpful to you. So check it out. Watch the video. I'm going to make a few more later on in the semester for other topics, and I hope this works out well for you. So have a great day. Go Bears.